I'm not going to say that this is kind of a review of that, because she did a great job, I thought, of hitting kind of the highlights, hitting the highlights of it. But what we're going to do is we're going to dig in a little bit deeper and talk about timing and things like that, because especially on the addendum for sale of property by buyer, the contingency, the timing is critical here, of the things that what has to be done and how much time you have in order to get it done and things like that. So we're going to start with this one, the addendum for sale of other property by buyer. And then the other one that we're going to take a look at is the short sale addendum. We're starting to see situations where short sales are coming back, which is kind of odd, because you would think that with the amount of equity that has been built up in properties lately, over the last 2, 3, 4 years, you would think that there'd be so much equity in these properties that the need for a short sale just wouldn't exist. If you're not familiar with the short sale is a situation where if I go to sell my property and I can't sell it for enough to cover what I owe my existing lender, I can't sell that property unless I'm going to bring cash out of pocket to settle up the rest of what is owed the lender. If I don't plan on doing that, the only way I can do that transaction is with the permission of my existing lender. My existing lender has to approve that sale. And of course, most of the time that existing lender is not going to approve the sale until we actually have a contract in place. But I think what has happened an awful lot is that a lot of people have borrowed against that equity, that they have borrowed it to the point to where the equity is used up right now, that they maybe borrowed against it, even though Texas does have a limit of 80% of your equity, that you can only borrow up to 80% of your equity. Some people may have done some other things to where these short sales are starting to come around. And I think a lot of what we're starting to see also has to do with the fact that values have leveled off. And in some places, they actually have dropped just a little bit, not much, not enough to hit the panic button or anything like that, but have dropped maybe just enough to where when you include closing costs and maybe some other things that have to be paid out for repairs and maybe closing costs on behalf of the buyer, there's just not enough equity to cover everything that needs to be covered. So we're going to take a look at that one too. But we're going to start with this one, the addendum for sale of other property by buyer, which of course creates a contingency. And that contingency is that I have to get my existing home sold, closed, and funded before I can go ahead and close on the one that I'm trying to buy. So this is required if the buyer does not have access to the funds right here, right now. And so I know sometimes agents kind of fudge a little bit on that, where they will leave this addendum out because they know that by putting this addendum in, a lot of times that's going to make the seller, based on the advice of their listing agent, not want to work with this type of offer because they're afraid that the existing home won't get sold and they'll have their home tied up. And that way, and it would keep them from being able to sell maybe to somebody else. And so a lot of times the listing agent will convince the seller that a contingency sale, including this addendum, is just not a good idea. It's too much risk to take. And so the buyer's agent, knowing that, will sometimes leave this addendum out, even though the buyer has to get closed on their existing home in order to be able to buy the one they're trying to buy. They'll leave this addendum out. And what they'll try to do is they'll try to extend that time frame on the third party to 21, 25 days, knowing that if they can't get the existing home sold, they can always bail out using that 21, 22, 23 days. They can always go ahead and bail out and say, oh, sorry, I'm not going to qualify. But that doesn't really work, because if the buyer does not have access to those funds right then and there, that form is a requirement. And it will be found out, because when they don't get their existing loan and the lender says why they don't get their existing loan, and the reason is because they didn't get their existing home sold and closed, then that's going to be an issue. So anyway, we're going to take a look at this addendum. When you look at it, it looks like It's not a lot of risk for the seller, but the reality is it really is. The seller probably really needs to be prepared for this contingency offer to be the only one they get. And we'll see why when we get into that part of it. So we're going to start first looking at Section A, which of course says the contract is contingent upon the buyer's receipt of the proceeds from the sale of the buyer's property at, and of course that's where we're going to put in the existing home. And that has to be on or before some certain date. And it says that if the contingency is not satisfied or waived by that date, the contract automatically terminates and the buyers get their earnest money back. So not a lot of risk for the buyer here. The buyer's tying up this property, and if for whatever reason their existing home does not sell, close, and fund by the date that we put on there, then the deal automatically terminates and the buyer gets their earnest money back. So not a lot of risk there, not for the buyers. And it says under notice, make sure that the date that you put in there is no later than the closing date that we put in the actual sales contract itself. It can't be. If I'm saying I need the proceeds from this one in order to buy the next one, then I have to have the proceeds at least by the closing date on the other one, and probably a few days before, at least 2 or 3 days before. So make sure that your dates match up here. It's got to be that whatever closing date you show in Section 9 of the contract has to be later than or equal to or later than, and probably later than, the days that you put here. It doesn't make any sense to make that later. And I've seen that happen where they will put the contingency later than the actual closing date of the contract. Well, it makes no sense. It can't be that way because I need the money from this one to be able to close on the other one. I'm not going to be able to close on the other one until this one sells. All right, so B, here's where it looks like that maybe the seller doesn't have a lot of risk, but the reality is probably a little bit different. So B says, if the seller accepts a written offer to sell the property, seller shall notify the buyer, number one, of such acceptance, and number two, that the seller requires that buyer to waive the contingency. In other words, you have to do away with this contingency. You're going to buy my house no matter what. Buyer must waive the contingency on or before the certain number of days that we put in there after the seller's notice to buyer. Otherwise, the contract will terminate automatically and the earnest money gets refunded to the buyer. So again, not a lot of risk for buyer. But when you look at that provision, when you look at B, it makes it sound like, and it's true, that the seller can continue to offer the property for sale to somebody else. It's just that if another offer comes in, we have to notify this first offer and give them the opportunity to either waive the contingency or terminate, get out of the way, so I can work with the second offer. That's what it says. So it sounds like for the seller, it sounds like, well, it's not that much risk. The seller can continue to market the property for sale. And if something else comes in, then yeah, I've got to give the first one a certain number of days, whatever number of days we put in there. And if that doesn't, if the first buyer doesn't remove the contingency, then it's going to terminate and I can move on to the second one. Not a lot of risk, right? Well, that's not really reality, because MLS rules require, as soon as this goes under contract with the first buyer, that the status in MLS changes, has to change from active to pending continue to show. It cannot remain active. It's not active. It's under contract. Yes, it's a contingency contract, but it's still under contract. So the house in MLS status must change from active to pending continue to show. A lot of agents will not take a buyer to see a pending continue to show property. And of course, the reason they don't is because they know it's already under contract. Their fear, the agent's fear, is that if I go out and show my buyer this pending continue to show property, my buyers are going to fall in love with it. They're going to fall in love with it. They're going to want it. And so we go ahead and write up the offer, and you know how that works. By that point, my buyer is emotionally invested in this property. Not financially yet, but they are emotionally invested in this property. And they're in love with it. They've already pictured themselves living there. They've pictured the whole thing. But before we can sign off on that deal, we've got to come back to our first buyers and give them the opportunity. Well, the agent who's working with those second buyers' fear is that this first buyer is going to remove the contingency and maybe go with one of those programs where I can buy first and sell later, or something like that, where I can actually access my equity on my existing home before I ever sell it and come and purchase this one. So they're going to waive the contingency, which now the second agent with their buyers are now out in the cold. And so that agent's fear is that the house they fell in love with and they're not going to get, that nothing else will ever stack up. What does everybody want? What they can't have. And so this second buyer will look at house after house after house after house. None of them will measure up to the one they can't have. And eventually the buyers will give up, go become renters again, and that agent is out of a transaction. And so a lot of agents just will not even show the pending continue to show property.
And I'm always the contrarian here, but Don's absolutely correct. But I'll say, but with one exception. If you have a buyer that cannot find what they want, you've shown them everything in the market, or they're getting beat out for a property when they go on and they have a tight budget and they can't go above and beyond. These are great opportunities because no one's looking at them. And if they've been contingent for a while, this may be an opportunity for them to steal a property that fits their criteria. This is one of those things that you can use, setting the expectation that there's no guarantee. But I've won property this way for clients because we can come in with a stronger offer and we can close right away. Here we go. And the first buyer can't. So don't rule them out, but understand that there are risks to it as well.
It's a similar argument for backup contracts. Same thing for the backup contracts. If I don't have anything else available, then you have to take the risk that you have to take. But like Marty said, we need to make sure that the buyer clearly understands the possibilities here. So yeah, absolutely. All right, so there's B. So what number of days are we talking about there? If I'm thinking about a second buyer and how much time they're going to be willing to sit on the fence and wait, most of the time it's not a really long period of time. I would not be sticking 7 days in there, or probably even 5 days. I think 1 to 3 is probably, because really what do we want? We want this first buyer to make a decision. We want them, if that decision is thrust upon them, where they have to decide, are you definitely buying my house or not? We want that decision to be made quickly. And the longer that we give it, the more opportunity there could be for the first offer to find a way to make that work. So if I'm the seller, I probably want that number of days to be pretty quick. I don't want to wait forever, because I really run the risk of losing that second buyer. Because the second buyer may not really be willing to wait 5 days or 7 days, because during this waiting period that the second offer has, they can always go and find something else. If there's something else available, they could go out, find something else, and they could withdraw. And while they're sitting here waiting to find out if they are going to get this property or not, they can always withdraw their offer. So I don't want to leave it hanging out there so long that my second buyer starts losing interest and starts moving and start looking at other things and walking away. So, Marty?
That is a very real risk. I haven't seen it too much, but in the time it takes for the second buyer is always still looking. They could find the ideal property in that window where you've given notice to the first buyer. The first buyer comes back and they say, no, we can't do it. We terminate. And all of a sudden the second buyer, before you get back to them, they walk away too. This is a risk to the seller, losing both of them. So
now you're completely out. Yeah. So definitely this type of transaction is not without risk. I mean, really, the first buyer is the one that really has very little risk here. I mean, they're getting everything pretty much their way. There's so many opportunities to terminate and walk away and get earnest money back that for a buyer, there's really not much risk. All right, let's look at C. We'll talk about the risk for the buyer here in a minute. It'll come up in D. So for C, buyer may waive the contingency only by notifying the seller of waiver and depositing X amount of dollars with the escrow agent as additional earnest money. And so a lot of times, and for whatever reason, almost every time I see this addendum, I see zero there. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, do we really want to let the buyer just go ahead and cruise along here without investing even more, getting more invested in this property? Is that really what we want? So I always recommend putting something in there. This will really make sure that this buyer, this first buyer, is really now committed to making this thing work. Whatever the original earnest money was, they can already get all that back. But do I really want that to be the full amount of their commitment? But it's whatever gets negotiated out. I've seen it everywhere from $0 to maybe $1,500 or something like that, where we want that additional money. So now the buyer may even be more invested than they were before. Because remember, whichever buyer I end up with, I want them just as committed, just as invested as I can get them. Here's the risk for the buyer, letter D. And a lot of times this one is not understood a lot for whatever reason. And it may be that the language is not completely clear as to what they're really saying here, but it does make sense. If the buyer waives the contingency and fails to close and fund solely due to the buyer's non-receipt of proceeds from the buyer's property described in paragraph A above, buyer will be in default. In other words, if the buyer number one, when faced with the decision of waiving the contingency or terminating, if the buyer decides to waive, knowing that if they don't get their existing home and sold and closed, then they're not going to qualify for their loan, and thinking, oh, that's how I can get out of this deal. I can get out because I won't qualify for the deal. Well, it says if you waive that contingency and you fail to close because your existing home did not close and fund, then your earnest money is at risk. You don't get your earnest money back, or whatever other remedy the seller cares to enforce, whether it be specific performance or monetary damage, whatever it is. So that's what D says. So there is risk for the buyer here now. And that risk is if you waive and you put in the additional earnest money, because now that also will be at risk. It won't just be your original earnest money. It would now be that additional earnest money that we required in section C there. Now all of that earnest money is at risk. That's what it says, buyer's in default. If such default occurs, seller can exercise the remedies that you find in paragraph 15 of the contract, which is specific performance, liquidated damages, monetary damage. And so that way, the buyer doesn't give the buyer the ability to think, oh, well, if I go ahead and waive it and I don't get my existing home sold, then I'll never qualify for the other house and I can get out that way. No, you can't. Even if you're in that 21 days or whatever it is in the third party, this will override that. It'll say, nope, you're not going to get it. And then E, for purposes of this addendum, it's one of the few places in real estate contracts where we see this, time is of the essence. And so what does is of the essence means? It means that these time frames that you see here are hard and fast, that they are not what we call flexible time, where something could happen in this time frame, but if it doesn't, then it doesn't necessarily kill the deal. It says here that time is of the essence, strict compliance with the times for performance herein is required. So whatever the time frames are that you've required here, whatever you have put in there, those time frames can only be changed one way and one way only, and that's through an amendment signed by both the buyer and the seller. Otherwise, the timing is exact. The timing that you see in the document is an exact time frame, and it has to be in that time frame. Everything has to be done in that time frame. So, all right, that's the way that one looks. So anybody have any questions on that before we get and look at the the short sale one. Anybody have any questions? Anything that any situations that they want to talk about or anything like that? No. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Reva, go ahead. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Go ahead.
perfect. I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So with the buyer waiving the contingency, at what point would they do that? Once they know that their current home is under contract, or would that be like a
that's not in here, but yes, once they know that they're going to be able to meet that contingency, once a contingency has been satisfied, there is a waiver that they can use to waive that. But here, the decision is kind of forced on them. It's forced on them before they're getting their home sold. Before they have their existing home sold, closed, and funded, the sellers have another buyer that they want to accept an offer from. And so before they can accept that offer, they have to come back to the first buyer and give them the opportunity to either waive that contingency or terminate. So what you're describing, that's another way that, yes, the buyer can waive the contingency, which is by satisfying it and getting their home sold, closed, and funded ahead of time. That can do it too. But this one is kind of forced on them, where the other one happened naturally. They got their home sold, closed. This one is being forced on them because the seller has another contract they want to work with.
But there's a benefit too if a buyer can and know the house is going to close or does close early, then they remove the seller's ability to accept the backup offer. They basically no longer can they be bumped, if you will. They can accept the offer, but they can't send notice anymore. So if the buyer is concerned, get more activity, whatever it is, this is the way they can themselves make the choice to say, yeah, I'm moving forward. So yeah, good.
Okay, that clears it up. Thank you so much.
Yep, they could do that if they want, but they better be sure. Because once they remove this contingency, they better be sure.
And this is one too that I know you went over it, Don, but what a lot of our agents ask is that when the property sells. No, it's when the property closes. And so that protection goes all the way through in case something happens the day before closing and buyer or seller bails. And that's one of the big risks to the seller too, is it's only based on the proceeds of the sale. That buyer that becomes a seller may choose not to sell, and they have a free out at that point in time because they didn't get no proceeds. So keep that in mind too.
That's right. It's sell, close, and fund it, because it talks about receipt of proceeds, and it's even bolded out, the receipt of proceeds. Yeah. So it's all of that. And that's why we said that normally, because the receipt of proceeds is going to be used as the probably down payment for the house they're trying to buy, we probably need a day or two in there. It's probably going to be really, really tough to make it work if you're trying to close both of them on the same day. I'm not saying it can't happen. It could, where they just wire transfer the funds from this deal onto the one that they're trying to buy, from the existing home to this home. They can do that. But it's great if you can give it at least a day to make that move, because the wire transfer is receipt of the proceeds. If we're caught in a wire transfer, then we haven't really received them yet. So you probably want to give it a day.
If it's same,
we may be talking semantics there.
Yeah, maybe same day you could use same title company, but oftentimes it's different states, different closing things too. So got to be careful. Yep. Nellie has a question.
Yeah, Nellie.
Hi, good morning. Trying to put the puzzle together here. So maybe you already covered this. So since the house is pending, continuing to show, right? So we'll get another buyer. They like it. We get another offer. So at what point, can we back out of this offer? The current offer that we have, we cannot. We have to wait and see what happens with the proceeds. Is that?
No, this is the form, and Don's talking about this too. The question, though, Nellie. So you're working with the seller. You have a signed around offer that's contingent on the sale of their property. Good. You get another offer that's now in backup position because you have a valid signed around contract with the first buyer. The seller doesn't want to work with the buyer anymore, but the only option they have is to send notice to the first buyer that we've received another offer we'd like to accept. Now you have a certain number of days to say, I'm moving forward or I'm terminating. And so it's back on the first buyer to make the choice. The seller has no control other than that. Say, we've accepted an offer.
Committed.
Yep. If the first buyer decides to move forward, seller has to sell to them. There's no.
Wow.
There's no
Okay.
Yeah.
So buyer's in control pretty much until if we get it back up. Okay. Got it. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. That's it. And I have seen this happen, and where a buyer's agent submitting an offer with this contingency, knowing that a lot of listing agents kind of have their sellers really think about whether or not they want to deal with this potential issue here, that the buyer's agent, I have seen this actually happen, where the buyer's agent sends a message to the listing agent and says, hey, look, I know that you're supposed to put this in pending continue to show, but we'll go ahead and let you keep it active. We'll go ahead and let you keep it active in MLS in order to try to get their offer accepted by the seller. Because that's going to be the issue, is that the listing agent's going to tell the seller, you know, we're going to have to put this, if we accept this, we're going to have to change the status from active to pending continue to show. And the number of showings is probably going to drop off, you know, maybe 50%, maybe 75%, maybe 90%, unless you're Marty McClendon and you go out and show it.
Right.
But other than that, almost a lot of other ones won't show. And so the buyer's agent, knowing that, will tell the listing agent, you go ahead and leave it active. We don't care. You'll just go ahead and leave it active. And that way they'll go ahead and get the seller to feel comfortable going ahead and accepting this. And so I saw that happen once where they said that. But the buyer's agent does not have control over the rules of the MLS.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that, if you leave it active, you're violating MLS rules, and you can get hit with a fine if they find out. Now, in this situation that I'm talking about, mysteriously, after they accepted this and they went ahead and kept it active in MLS, mysteriously, somebody notified HAR that this seller, that this listing was showing active, and they thought that they had accepted some kind of offer. And I bet you any amount of money, it was that buyer's agent who went and notified HAR. And so, of course, HAR digs into it and says, hey, somebody has said that you have this listing showing as active, and you actually have accepted a contract. Is that right? And now they had to go ahead and put it in pending continue to show anyway. And so, you know, that's pretty sneaky. It's pretty gutsy. It's pretty sneaky. So, Beam, go ahead.
Yeah, within how many days or hours they need to change the status in MLS?
3.
3 days. Oh, there is a 3 days grace period. That's fine.
Status is supposed to be changed within 3 days. Accurate information is supposed to be put in within 3 days. So
3 days.
yeah,
It's not 3.
If it goes pending or option pending, they do have, unless they've changed it. It used to be 3 days.
3 calendar days.
3 calendar days. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And unless they've changed it, that's what it's always been. So anyway, okay. Any other questions on this one? Any questions on this one? Anything else that we need to cover? B, like I said, normally that number of days there is fairly short. We want to make that fuse pretty short. We don't want that second buyer hanging out there for too long a period of time and running the risk of them moving away and losing buyer number one because they decided, yeah, we're not really sure enough that our house is going to sell, so we're going to go ahead and terminate, and seller ends up losing both deals.
I would say one thing though. Let's say you have a continuing offer. It's a good offer except for the fact that they have to sell their house, and another offer comes along. You want to make sure you negotiate that second offer really, really well. You know, removing contingencies, strong cash offer, whatever it may be, because that second buyer could bail too.
That's true too. Yeah,
so you want to make sure it's actually a better offer.
There are times, you're right, that there are times that the contingency may still be better than the other one. Yeah. Yep, absolutely. There was something else. There was something else that hit me for just a second that I wanted to put in there, and I can't remember what the heck it was now. Whatever it was, it's gone. Maybe it'll come back. It'll hit me upside the head tonight when I'm sleeping or something, probably. So anyway, oh, I know what it was. It was whether or not the listing agent and the seller are likely or maybe not likely to entertain this contingency. You know, if you don't even have your house on the market yet, if you're working on the buyer side of this deal and you don't even have your house on the market yet, it's going to be pretty tough to get them to even consider this contingency, because their concern, of course, is going to be, well, what are they going to list the property for? You know, are they even going to be realistic in what they're trying to get? Or, you know, is this some kind of pipe dream where, yeah, they'll sell their existing home if they can get X amount of dollars, but yet they're tying us up while they try to do whatever it is they're trying to do. If the house is already at least listed, then at least the listing agent can kind of pull comps and look and see, is it listed at a number that makes sense? What's the likelihood? What's the average number of days that a house in this neighborhood sits on the market? What have they, kind of like doing a CMA, where the listing agent may do a CMA on this buyer's property to see whether or not it looks like that they're being realistic or not. You know, the further along they are, the more likely it is that the listing side or the seller would entertain this type of offer. You know, if it's one that is already under contract and maybe already through the option period, you know, then it really starts looking more and more like this is probably a deal that will close. And you know how it is when you get closer and closer to the closing date, there are fewer and fewer things that can knock you out. So yeah, that's where I was headed. That's what I was trying to think of, is that, yeah, we really want to try to have everything in order on our side before we go and make an offer on the other side.
I would say to add on to that, Don, if you're the listing agent when you receive a contingent offer, find out who's listing the buyer's property, call the agent, see if it is listed, see what they're doing for marketing. Is it in good condition? What market's in? That's your job, advocating for your seller to make sure that the person who is listing it, sometimes it's the buyer's agent who's also the listing agent. Sometimes it's not. So find out and interview them so you have confidence that they know what they're doing and it will be priced right and sell and so forth, to Don's point.
Yeah, that's a listing agent that's different than the agent that's writing this offer. That listing agent's probably not going to be happy about this. But a lot of times they don't have anybody to blame but themselves when they missed this. They missed this opportunity. So yeah. All right. Anything else? Anybody else on this form before we move on to the next one? I hope this helps, because this one, there's so many twists and turns to it and so many different deadlines that we have to be able to meet and know who's who here. And it's hard enough to try to keep the timeline straight for one buyer, let alone two buyers, and how they interact with each other and how they kind of depend on each other on whether or not they're going to go through or not go through. So this is one of those forms that I like to go over every once in a while, just because, and they haven't changed it. I think the date on this form is maybe 15 years ago, 14 years ago. Yeah. They haven't changed it. They haven't changed it in years, but it's still one of the most easily misunderstood documents and contingencies and addenda that we run into, just because of all the different time frames and all of that. Hey, Javier, what you got?
Hey, Don, sorry. I just thought, do these things change a little bit as the market goes one way or the other? Because I've noticed, I mean, there's like in the past, I did one with contingency years ago, and it was really easy. I mean, there was like no if, ands, or buts. It was a very simple process. But I know that sometimes when the market's a different way, maybe it'll be a little trickier to get them through, get them accepted.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely that in a market where if the listing agent feels confident that we don't have to deal with this, that there's going to be enough other buyers out there that we'll be able to get one that's not a contingency, then their advice might be, I think we can let this one go because I'm pretty sure we'll get something like that. And so it might be harder to get through in that point. But, the seller who's considering this offer, this contingency offer, kind of has to put themselves in the same boat as this buyer who's a seller as well. And so if this seller is concerned that, hey, there may not be anything else come along, then it may be that this may be their best shot at trying to get that through. And then they have to think about the fact that if I'm thinking that, then gosh, I wonder, I want this buyer / seller to be further along in their transaction than not even have it on the market. So you're right. The market can dictate a lot of different possibilities in decision making, and whether or not it's going to go through easily or not go through easily. A lot depends on that. The seller may also feel like, well, if the market is so great that properties are moving quickly, this contingency may not be that much of a risk. They should be able to get their property sold pretty easily. If this was 2021, the first half of 2022, when things were selling $5, $10, $15, $20,000 more than asking price anyway, it really wouldn't matter too much what price we had on that property. So, yeah.
I will say, as a listing agent, I don't mind contingent offers generally. If I can talk to my seller and say, look, we got a good offer, we can negotiate strongly on this. Oftentimes, if the market is giving up 3 to 5% in concessions, like list the sales price, right? I'll hold firm at full price on a contingent offer. We're not going to budge on terms. You pay us what we're asking for the property, and then we'll accept your offer because you're asking us to pull it off the market, if you will, to go in contingent status. And so you're advocating for more for the seller for taking the risk. And then all that does is it also, if you do get a backup offer, you can hold them to the same standard because you already have an offer in place. So it's a way, as a listing agent, if things aren't moving, or if you were going to take a bigger drop in price for the seller, is it a way of negotiating more for your seller in lieu of, or because they're taking a risk of being off the market longer, the diminishing showings and whatever. I've used it to my advantage before.
Yeah, absolutely. And the offer may naturally be better than what it normally would have been anyway, because they know that this is a riskier type offer with this contingency. The buyer's agent may advise the buyer, you probably need to go a little bit further than what you would normally go here, because again, there is that risk for the seller. And so let's sweeten the pot. Let's put enough incentive in there to make the seller really consider this seriously rather than just dismiss it. And so naturally, by itself, without the listing side requiring it, it may come in that way anyway. So, yeah.
True.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? Any others? It's like a chess game. I mean, so much of what we do in real estate is like a chess game. It's trying to figure out the other side's move before they make it and anticipate what that move is going to be. And so before you make your move, you anticipate what the response is going to be, and you make your move based on that. I mean, there's so much of real estate that is like a chess game. It's not even funny. All right. Let's go back, and now let's move to our short sale addendum. Now, back to the same place here. Let me go find it. Too big. Too big. Oh, that's right. You guys can see what I was doing there. You can see me screw that up. Oh, great. All right, let's talk about short sale addendum. And this one, the very first short sale addendum came out in like 2009. And it's not really that a short sale is anything new. It's just you never really heard much about them. I think this, to me, this goes all the way back to when I first got my license in the 1980s, when we were in a place where foreclosures were just absolutely rampant. I think lenders learned in the 1980s that they did not like owning property. I think they realized that we need to do whatever we can to keep from owning property. And so the next time, at the next cycle, which was started at about 2007, the next cycle, when all these properties were fixing to go into foreclosure, they came up, or reintroduced maybe, the idea of the short sale. And so the short sale, like we said at the beginning of this, the short sale is where, as a seller, I'm going to sell my property, but the proceeds from what I receive from selling that property will not be enough to pay off my existing loan. And so almost everybody's loan has what we call the alienation clause. And the alienation clause says that if I transfer ownership of my property to anybody, I have to pay off my existing loan. And so, of course, that's where that subject to thing comes in as a problem. The subject to transactions, where where a buyer's asking to take over the seller's payment without notifying the existing lender. Well, the problem with that is that alienation clause that says that if you transfer ownership to anybody, you have to pay off your existing loan, that it cannot be left hanging out there. It has to be fully satisfied upon transfer to somebody else. And so if I'm selling my property and I owe the lender $300,000, and for whatever reason, I can only sell my property for $300,000, and the net is going to be $280,000, then I'm $20,000 short. And so my existing lender expects that $20,000 somehow. And so their expectation is that as the seller, I'm going to bring $20,000 to the table to satisfy the remainder of that amount that is owed to the lender. The short sale allows me, as the seller, to not have to do that. And so what happens is that if I'm going to sell my property and the amount that I'm going to net is not enough to pay off the existing loan, and I don't have the financial ability to pay the difference, then the only way that I could accept that offer that's going to net less than I owe is to go to my existing lender and get their permission. I have to get their permission to sell the house for what I can sell it for, and the difference is a loss to the lender. And so, of course, when you use those two words in the same sentence, loss and lender, you know that that's not going to be an easy thing. The lender does not like the idea of losing money. That's not what they're in business to do. But there are times where the lender, who hates foreclosure so much that they would go ahead and allow this to occur. They would go ahead and allow the seller to sell that property and net $20,000 less, and in return, let the seller off the hook for the rest. Because when you look at our addendum, the addendum is not only asking the existing lender to take less money, it's asking them to like it and not pursue the seller for the difference. And that's right there in A. So let's take a look at it. So the short sale addendum, I'm selling my property. It's not going to net enough to pay off the existing lender. So I'm using this form to ask the existing lender to approve that sale. Let that sale go through. And I know a lot of times they talk about whether or not the lender will even consider or entertain a short sale. And the majority of the time, the lender will say, yes, we would consider it, or yes, we would entertain it, but they probably won't tell you exactly what they would accept ahead of time, because they know if they tell you exactly what they would accept ahead of time, that's what they're going to get. And so they would rather see the offer first. They would rather have the offer in hand and give them the ability to figure out how much are we going to lose based on this before they give it approval. They're probably not going to give it approval beforehand. It's going to have to be turned in. They may have an idea, but they were going to have to wait to have it turned in, because a lot of times the seller or the existing lender wants to check this seller out. They want to check the seller out and make sure that the seller doesn't have a bank account with $100,000 sitting over here that they could tap into to pay the difference. They want to make sure that, in most cases, they want to make sure that there is a hardship, that the seller is going through some sort of financial hardship, going through some issue where getting the difference out of them is going to be impossible anyway. So A talks about this involves a short sale, and it says when used in this addendum, short sale means, number one, that the seller's net proceeds at closing from this sales transaction will be insufficient to pay the balance of the seller's mortgage loan. So that means the existing lender is not getting fully paid off. And two, the seller requires. Here's the part that if the lender agrees to this, the lender is not only agreeing to accept less, they're agreeing to not pursue the seller for the difference, which they could. They could pursue the seller through a deficiency judgment. They could pursue the seller by giving them a 1099 and saying, hey, the difference between what you owe and what we accept, that difference there, that's income. So here's a 1099 for that $20,000 difference. Enjoy paying income tax on that. They could do either one, but this says they won't. It says the seller requires A, the consent of the lien holder to sell the property pursuant to this contract, which means the lender, existing lender, gives permission for the seller to proceed, even though it's not going to pay off the existing lender. And B, the lien holder, that's the lender, the lender's agreement to one, accept the seller's net proceeds in full satisfaction of the seller's liability under the mortgage loan, which means they will get a release. They will get a release of lien and the seller gets off the hook. And two, provide the seller that executed release of lien against the property in a recordable format, which of course frees it up to be sold to somebody else. So the lender's taking it on the chin here, and they may prefer that. They may prefer going ahead and losing $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 here rather than having to go ahead and go into foreclosure and then own the property for a while and then potentially ending up losing $20,000 later when they go to sell the property anyway. So the lender is going to do what's best for them. Whatever is best for them, which sometimes is losing money here, that's what they're going to do. If it makes financial sense to the lender to go ahead and do it now, then they'll go ahead and do it here. All right, let's look at B. As used in this addendum, seller's net proceeds means the sales price minus or less seller's expenses under paragraph 12 of the contract and the seller's obligation to pay any brokerage fees. So it used to be, when the short sales really first started becoming a thing in 2007 and through about 2011, a lot of times in the short sale, the lender, the existing lender, would let this thing drag out all the way to the very end. And at that point, come back to the agents. They would come back to the agents and they would say, you know, we're so close. We're so close to being able to make this thing work. But the only way we're really going to make it work is if you agents take less money. And so they put it on the real estate agents to take less money than what they were really had already agreed to in order to make the short sale work. This says that whatever the seller has already agreed to in the contract has to remain. So that's a good deal for us. That helps us out a lot, where the existing lender now can't come back and try to knock down the amount of commission being paid to the agents, because they used to do that. But here it says the seller's already obligated, so we're going to work off of those numbers. That whatever that net is going to be is what we have to work with. So it becomes a yes or a no rather than a no, but if you agents would take less money, we could make this thing work. So that's good for us. C, the contract to which this addendum is attached is binding upon execution of the parties, and the earnest money and the option fee must be paid as provided in the contract. So even though this is a contingency sale, and the contingency is that the existing lender has to approve this, and that may take 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, whatever, buyer still has to put up their earnest money and their option fee at the very beginning. It can't wait until the existing lender approves this deal. The buyer has to put up their earnest money and their option fee right here, right now, at the time of contract. But it says contract is contingent on the satisfaction of the seller's requirements under paragraph A2 of this addendum, which means the existing lender approves it. That's the lien holder's consent and agreement. Seller shall apply promptly for and make every reasonable effort to obtain the lien holder's consent and agreement, and shall furnish all information and documents required by the lien holder. So whatever it is that the lender feels like they need from the seller, for the seller to prove this hardship to the lender, the seller agrees to get that information to them as soon as possible, that they will get it to them immediately. They would get that information to them. So it's probably going to be like tax returns. It's probably going to be bank statements. It's probably going to be, if they have a job, it's going to be their verification of employment. It's going to be all that stuff that the lender is going to use to determine that, yes, this is the best course of action for us.
The key thing there is getting permission to work on behalf of the seller, if so you can speak to the lender on these things. Number two, like you said, there's usually a hardship letter. It has to qualify for certain types of hardship. And like you said, there's usually a financial worksheet where they list their assets and income and that kind of stuff, so that the lender can make a decision. Are they able to pay, or are they not able to pay? Yep.
And the information is the opposite of a buyer trying to get a loan. A buyer trying to get a loan is going to try to make that information look as good as possible. The seller trying to get the existing lender to agree to the short sale, it's going to make that look as bad as they possibly can.
100%. Yep.
Yep. Right.
One quick question. So at what time point we submit this addendum? After discussing with the lender, or?
It's part of the contract. It's part of the sales contract between the buyer and the seller.
Once we know it is a short sale, it's listed as a short sale.
As soon as that offer is being made, it needs to be made clear to the buyer that this is a short sale, so the buyer's agent can fill this out. If for some reason that doesn't happen and it is a short sale and we get a regular offer without this addendum, then the seller is going to have to send it back with the addendum and get the buyer to agree to that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, so we said that they're going to furnish that information to the lien holder. Says, except as provided by this addendum, neither party is required to perform under the contract while it is still contingent upon obtaining lien holder's consent and agreement. So what does that mean? It means that, yes, even though the buyer has to put up the earnest money and the option fee, their option period has not really started yet. Their option period does not start. They're not obligated to do any of the things under the contract yet. They're not obligated to do anything in terms of doing their inspections or any of that stuff. They're not obligated to do that yet. They do have to put up the earnest money. They do have to put up the option fee, but the remainder of the contract is just hanging out there for now. D says, if the seller does not notify the buyer that the seller has obtained lien holder's consent and agreement on or before a certain date, this contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So the date that needs to go in there is based on the comfort level of the buyer. How long is the buyer willing to wait for an answer? That's what it's there for. It says that if it doesn't happen by that date, the buyer has reached the limit of their patience. They're not willing to wait any longer. You hit that date, it all falls apart. If you hit that date and we have not got the approval of the existing lender yet, then the contract will terminate automatically. Earnest money will get refunded to the buyer. Option fee, however, is not refundable. Option fee, and there's a difference, I guess, between when we talk about option fee, we talk about it being refundable or it being credited. It is never, the option fee is never, ever, 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 ever refunded. It's never refunded. It is credited if they close. If they get to closing, the seller will credit that money back. But refunding the money is like taking the same money and giving it back. And that's not the case. Option fee is never refundable. Once it's paid here, it's spent. Because during this entire time that the buyer is waiting, they have kind of this additional option period that they didn't really have to pay for. They can change their mind at any time and walk away if they want. Here's E. This contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer if the lien holder refuses or withdraws its consent and agreement prior to closing and funding. So if the existing lender says no, buyer gets earnest money back. If the existing lender says yes and then changes their mind later and says no, buyer will get their earnest money back. Seller shall promptly notify the buyer of any lien holder's refusal to provide or withdrawal of a lien holder's consent and agreement. I have only seen a lender go back one time and withdraw. Have you seen it, Marty? Have you seen that happen before?
I have not. I've done quite a few of these. So usually actually I take it back. One time it was because they had to go to their investor on the guaranteed part and they wouldn't approve it. That was the only time. One time.
The one time that I saw it happen was the seller's financial situation changed. They got a job and they got a good job. And so the lender felt like, well, let's go ahead and keep this because we feel like that with the job that this individual has, that they should be able to get caught up. And so they decided to go ahead and they withdrew it and actually kept it with the seller. It's the only one I've ever seen. All right, so let's look at F. F is that one. Here's where F talks about the fact that the buyer still has this right to terminate during the time that the existing lender is making their decision. So F says, if the buyer has the unrestricted right to terminate this contract, which they do if they paid their option fee. So if they paid their option fee, then they have that unrestricted right to terminate. If they have that, the time for giving notice of termination begins on the effective date of the contract and will continue after the amended effective date. So here's where they first talk about an amended effective date. What is an amended effective date? It's the date that the approval from the existing lender happens. So I have my existing contract, let's say is dated today, August 12th. So that's the day, 3 days from now, I have to have my earnest money and my option fee paid to the title company. We now submit that contract to the existing lender. So all the time, and let's say the existing lender makes their decision on October 7th. All this time between today, August 12th and October the 7th, I have this additional option period where as the buyer, I can walk away. I can walk away, change my mind, walk away, and get my earnest money back. Not my option fee, but I can get my earnest money back. Starting October 7th, when the existing lender gives their approval, that's when all the dates in the actual contract kick in. My 10-day option period. My 10-day option period begins October 7th. But I get this additional time between today's date and October 7th without really having to pay anything extra for it. I paid for my 10-day option period at the beginning of the transaction. I still get that from when the existing lender approves this transaction, approves this short sale, then I get my 10 days after that. But everything between now and that date, I also have the right to terminate as well. So that's what it's saying, that it will begin on the effective date of the contract, continue for the number of days after that amended effective date, and then it'll end upon the expiration of the buyer's unrestricted right to terminate, the 7 days, 10 days, whatever we actually negotiated in paragraph 5 of the contract. So again, buyer can walk away. They can change their mind and walk away and get their earnest money back. All right, G, for the purposes of this addendum, time is of the essence. Again, all these timelines, all these time frames that are created here by this contingency, by this addendum, are time is of the essence. Strict compliance with the times for performance in this addendum is required. H, seller authorizes any lien holder to furnish to the buyer or the buyer's representatives information relating to the status of the request for the lien holder's consent and agreement. So that is saying that because a lot of this is confidential information, that this information is going to be shared with the buyer side. Buyer side has a right to know what's going on. If we're going to say that it's going to take the existing lender 45 days, 60 days, 90 days before they make a decision, the buyer and the buyer's agent has a right to know exactly what's going on. They may not tell them some confidential information. They may not tell them that, hey, we just found out that the seller actually has a bank account with $100,000 in it. And so that's going to have a real bearing on whether or not we approve this thing. What they could tell the buyer's agent, and therefore the buyer, is that we're still in the process of gathering information. It has not been approved yet. I'm not sure if it's going to be approved or not. If they want to give it some kind of percentage and say, hey, at this point, I'd say it's maybe 50-50 or whatever they want to do, they can. Still not giving out confidential information. They can't give out financial information about the seller and say, yeah, this one looks like a slam dunk because the seller has like $25 in their bank account and they don't have a job. And so, yeah, they're not going to give out that kind of information. It's not going to be that specific, but they can give the buyer and the buyer's agent a pretty clear idea on where the process is. We're still considering the information. We're still doing the things that we need to do to be able to determine yes or no. They give a status, but they're not going to give actual information. I talks about if there's more than one lien holder. If there's more than one lien holder or loan secured by the property, this addendum is going to apply to each loan. So it'll be first lien, second lien. If it's more than one loan that's involved, then both of them will have to approve it. Because if it's not enough to pay off one, it's probably not going to be enough to pay off the other. That's where this addendum.
Wow, that's good.
So that's pretty much what we've got for this addendum. Anybody have any questions that they have? I know there's a lot on this one. This one is an awful lot to take in because it's got so much information attached to it. And so we have any questions on this one or anything that we need to look at in a little bit more detail or any questions? We used to say that a short sale was probably the most misappropriately named transaction there was because it was never short and it was rarely a sale. But a lot of that has to do with the market. And even back in the day when it was 2007 through 2011, a lot of times we found that depending on where the property was would make a difference. Because in Houston, for a while, only about 11% of the short sale requests were actually going through. And of course, a lot of times what they found is that the seller really wasn't in the financial bind that they tried to let on. That it may be an investor or it may have been somebody who just felt like they made a bad investment. And so they were trying to crawl out from under it. And so a lot of them didn't go through. And it was for a whole year. I think it was 2008 or 2009 the percentage of transactions that went through on a short sale was about 11% here in Houston. It wasn't that much, but when you got into higher price markets like Austin, that number jumped up to like 35 to 40% that actually went through, because there was more hardship there because their sales prices were so much higher. And when we had the downturn in values there, their values went down 15 to 18%, where ours went down more like about 5 to 8%. They had much more of a drop than we did. So there were a lot more properties that and sellers that actually qualified for the short sale.
I came from the Seattle area market, and it was bad up there. So we had a lot of them that qualified. I did a bunch of these in 08, 07, 08, 09, probably 15 a year. I mean, it was crazy, but they got to the point where there were so many of them that they were pretty much streamlined. If you had a hardship, the seller was willing to participate, and you had, you could have a good comps and a good offer. You could get them done fairly quickly, a couple months, at the tail end of that. But yeah, they're interesting because the lien holder for the seller has to approve everything. What we found even recently doing one here in Texas, Don, was the lien holder can say, we won't pay for this. We had one where the lien holder said that the buyer had to pay the seller's title policy. So the buyer had to say, well, do I still want the property at this short sale amount? And they agreed to it. So you never know, right?
Yep. And you're right. I mean, they got towards the end there. They actually did. They streamlined it, and all the lenders got more consistent in their process. In the very beginning, when these first things really got started, it was like every lender was different, and they all had their own process, and you had to try to figure out what their process was. They had to try to figure out what their process was, because it was also so new that they all got hit with this all at once. But it was kind of like the foreclosures were in the 80s, where there were just so many of them. The lenders had no idea what all they were dealing with. And I think short sales were kind of that way in the very beginning too. But they did eventually. Marty, did you ever get the designation, the CDPE designation?
Certified short sale specialist.
Certified distressed property expert, CDPE. Yep. I think it's still out there. I think it's now privately owned by somebody, but I think it's still out there. These may be coming back. I think that there's a real possibility that we may be seeing some of these where people may have either borrowed as much as they could against that equity, try to take advantage of it. They were afraid that maybe property values were going to drop. So they thought, you know what, I'm going to pull out as much of this now as I can. And have that kind of situation. So we may be seeing more of these.
I know that each lender may be different as well. I know back in the day that there was a certain criteria. I found that like Wells Fargo was at the time 1 in 4 mortgages in America. And their criteria was they needed to net, after all the expenses to sell, like commissions, excise tax, HOA fees, whatever it is, they needed 82% of fair market value. It doesn't matter what the person owed on the property. If they had a loan for $500, but the fair market value was $450, it was 82% of that number. So when working with sellers, I could evaluate how good an offer would be. Would it come up if fair market value is $450, 82%? I do the math on that. Does that cover everything? If it
would that meet the 82% threshold?
Yep.
That's pretty neat. I mean, if you know that going in, then that really does tell you exactly what you're going to need to do in order to make that work. That would be great to know. I wonder if they use that percentage because of mortgage insurance, because anything below that would be a loss for them. And if they wanted to, probably that's close enough that they wouldn't even turn in a claim on mortgage insurance for that additional 2%. I bet it is too. That 2% is probably covered admin fees, basically, right? Yeah. That makes sense. So, all right. I know our class is usually 2 hours long, but we've still got about 45 minutes left. So of course we can entertain any questions anybody has or anything anybody wants to cover. But if we don't have anything, then we'll give you 45 minutes back and you can go do whatever you want to use that 45 minutes for. So Yeah. Anybody who has any questions, anything that they would like to add, or you know what we didn't do? We didn't record this.
Actually, we did. We're
Oh,
good.
never mind. We did. I knew that.
Here, in fact, I'll stop recording.